For 8 straight days, Vivian Cross's silver Bugatti Divo sat dead inside the most exclusive service center in New York City. 6 world-class technicians, 3 diagnostic systems airlifted from Europe, over $500,000 in labor equipment fees and emergency consultations, and not a single person could explain why a multi-million-dollar hypercar refused to start. Every system read normal. Every sensor reported clean. The engine simply would not fire. On the morning of day 9, Vivian gave her lead specialist 24 hours to produce results before she pulled the contract entirely. That same morning, Caleb Monroe pulled up to the service center's rear gate in a dented tow truck, delivering a set of lift tools that had been ordered by mistake. He wore a faded denim jacket. His hands were calloused and stained with grease he'd never quite scrubbed out. Nobody at Crossline Motors gave him a second glance. Then he walked past the Bugatti. He stopped, looked at it for maybe 5 seconds, asked one question nobody else had thought to ask. 5 minutes later, the engine was running. What did Caleb Monroe see that 6 experts had missed? If you enjoy stories about real expertise, quiet competence, and the people who get overlooked until they're the only ones who can solve the problem, this channel is for you. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Vivian Cross did not tolerate inefficiency. Not in her employees, not in her contracts, and certainly not in the machines she owned. At 46, she was the founder and chairman of Crossline Motors, a New York-based firm that sourced authenticated and sold hypercars and collector vehicles to the kind of clientele who didn't ask about financing. Her reputation was built on precision, the right car, the right provenance delivered on time and without drama. In an industry full of showmanship, Vivian's value was that she never oversold anything. What she said was accurate. What she promised was delivered. That was the entire business. She was not warm. She was not interested in being warm. The people who worked for her understood that competence was the currency she respected, and sentiment was something she had very little use for. The Bugatti Divo had arrived from Molsheim 6 months earlier, a bespoke commission in silver with a faint blue undertone that shifted depending on the light. It was one of only 40 in existence, and the only one configured to her exact specifications. Vivian didn't drive it often. She didn't need to. The car existed as a statement, a physical representation of what it meant to operate at the level she operated at. In her world, the right object in the right room said more than any title ever could. Victor Hale understood that language fluently. As the lead technician and founding partner of Apex Hypercar Solutions, he had built his career on exactly that kind of clientele. His firm handled vehicles that most certified mechanics would never see in a lifetime Paganis Koenigsegg's one-off Le Mans derivatives factory race cars converted for road registration. Victor was meticulous, well-credentialed, and completely aware of both facts. He spoke about his work the way surgeons spoke about procedures, with the quiet authority of someone who had never seriously considered the possibility of being wrong. Mason Reed was 28 and had no such authority, not yet. He had joined Apex 14 months earlier after 2 years at a regional performance shop in New Jersey, where he had developed a reputation for finding faults that the diagnostic software missed. He wasn't the fastest technician on the floor. He wasn't the most polished. But he paid attention to things other people moved past, and he had learned early that machines communicated in ways that didn't always show up on a screen. On the second day of the Bugatti job, Mason had suggested checking the supplemental grounding system. Victor had dismissed it without looking up from his laptop. Mason wrote the suggestion in his personal notebook and said nothing more. Caleb Monroe had no notebook, no firm, and no presence in any room that mattered. He ran a small garage in Queens, oil changes, brake jobs, transmission work on trucks, and delivery vans that couldn't afford downtime. On nights when the shop was slow, he drove a tow truck. He was 42 years old, and he had not thought about Bugatti in a long time. The Bugatti had stopped working on a Tuesday morning in January. Vivian's driver had arrived at the private garage at 7:15, same as every weekday. He inserted the key card, followed the startup sequence, and pressed the ignition button. Nothing happened. No engine turnover, no warning lights, no error codes on the display. The dashboard illuminated normally. Every system indicator showed green. The car simply refused to start the way a person might refuse to speak, present aware and completely unresponsive. By 9 o'clock, Victor Hale was on site with 3 technicians and a diagnostic rig that cost more than most people's annual salary. By noon, he had ruled out the primary battery, the starter relay, and 2 of the most common ECU faults associated with cold weather startups. By the end of day 1, he was confident the problem was contained to the electrical system and would be resolved within 48 hours. It was not resolved within 48 hours. Over the following week, the Apex team worked through the car with the kind of systematic thoroughness that Victor's reputation demanded. They replaced the auxiliary battery. They updated the vehicle's firmware to the latest Bugatti factory release. They swapped out the central control module with a unit pulled from a verified identical configuration. They brought in a remote consultant from Stuttgart, who spent 6 hours on a video call reviewing telemetry data and concluded that the car's onboard systems showed no anomalies. They flew in a second consultant from Paris, a former Bugatti factory engineer who had worked on the Devo program, who examined the car in person and left without an explanation. 3 European diagnostic systems were brought in at additional cost. Each one returned the same result: no faults detected. On day 5, Mason Reed had raised his hand during the morning briefing and suggested for the second time that they examine the supplemental grounding network, specifically the secondary mass points associated with the voltage regulation system. He had done some reading the previous night and found a technical note referencing cold condition resistance variance in low-volume bespoke configurations. Victor had looked at him for a moment, then returned to the fault matrix on his screen. "We checked the ground points on day 1, Victor said. "Standard protocol. If there was a resistance issue significant enough to prevent ignition, the diagnostic would have flagged it. We're looking at something deeper." Mason did not argue. He wrote the suggestion in his notebook for the second time, closed it, and went back to work. By the morning of day 9, the total cost of the investigation had exceeded $500,000. Vivian had said nothing publicly, but the people close to her knew that silence was not patience, it was calculation. She was deciding something. In that morning's meeting, Victor presented his next recommendation, a full disassembly of the primary power distribution board, a process that would require 7 to 10 additional days and an estimated $150,000 in labor. He framed it as the logical next step, the only remaining variable that hadn't been physically inspected. Vivian listened without expression. When he finished, she set her pen down on the table. "You have 24 hours, she said. "If you don't have an answer by tomorrow morning, we're done." Victor nodded and left the room. 40 minutes later, a dented tow truck pulled up to the rear service entrance of Crossline Motors. The driver climbed out carrying a set of vehicle lift tools that someone in the parts department had ordered by mistake from a small garage in Queens. His name was Caleb Monroe. Caleb had been inside Crossline Motors for less than 4 minutes when he saw the car. He had followed a parts associate through the rear corridor toward the receiving desk, half listening to the man explain that the lift tool order had been placed in error and that someone in procurement would need to sign off before he could leave. Caleb didn't particularly care. He had 2 more deliveries after this one and a brake job waiting back at the shop. He was thinking about the brake job when they passed the entrance to the main service floor and the edge of the Bugatti came into view beneath its dust cover. He stopped walking. The cover didn't hide everything. The rear quarter panel was visible along with the exhaust cluster and a small bracket near the left rear wheel arch. It was the bracket that held his attention, a specific mounting configuration that didn't belong on a standard Devo. He had seen it before, not in a showroom or a service manual, but in a cold testing bay in Molsheim on a variant built specifically for low-temperature electrical stability in the North American market. A configuration so limited in production that most Bugatti dealers had never encountered one. He stood there for a moment, then looked at the nearest technician, a young guy in a gray Apex Polo, who had been watching him with mild suspicion. "What's wrong with that car?" Caleb asked. Mason studied him for a second before answering. "Been dead for 8 days. No one's figured out why." "When was it delivered?" Caleb said. "Was it part of a late-year bespoke order?" Mason blinked. It was a strange question, not the kind a delivery driver would ask. But it was also, he realized, exactly the kind of question that he wished someone on his team had asked 6 days ago. "I'd have to check the intake paperwork," he said slowly. He didn't get a chance to answer further. Victor Hale had appeared at the edge of the service floor, and his expression made clear that he had been watching the exchange for at least 30 seconds longer than he was comfortable with. "Can I help you with something?" Victor said, addressing Caleb with the specific tone of a man who was not offering to help. "Just asking about the car," Caleb said. "This is an active service area," Victor said. "We're in the middle of a sensitive diagnostic process on a client vehicle. I'm going to need you to wait by the receiving desk." Caleb didn't move immediately. He looked at the Bugatti for another moment, then back at Victor. "Have you checked the secondary mass line behind the voltage management unit in the rear compartment?" he said. The service floor went quiet. Victor's expression shifted not to curiosity, but to the particular stillness of someone who had just been challenged in front of an audience and was deciding how to respond. "We've checked every standard ground point in this vehicle," he said. "Multiple times. That's not the issue. That point isn't in the standard diagram," Caleb said. "It's only on certain bespoke builds configured for low-temperature electrical stability in the North American market." From the far side of the service floor, near the glass partition that separated the floor from the administrative corridor, Vivian Cross had stopped walking. She had come down to deliver a document to the floor supervisor and had no intention of staying. But she had heard the exchange, and something in it made her pause. The question had been too specific, too precise for someone who had wandered in off the street. She pushed open the door to the service floor and walked toward the two men. "How do you know that?" she said, looking at Caleb. Caleb turned to face her. "I worked low-voltage testing for the Divo program at Molsheim," he said. "Before I came back to the States." He paused. "My wife passed away. I wanted my daughter closer to family." Vivian looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the Bugatti. Then she looked at Victor, who was standing very still with the expression of a man who understood exactly what was happening and had no clean way to stop it. She turned back to Caleb. "You have 5 minutes," she said. Victor moved first. Before Caleb had taken a single step toward the car, Victor positioned himself between the two and addressed Vivian directly, his voice measured and professional, in the way that people use when they want to sound reasonable while doing something unreasonable. "I have to flag a liability concern," he said. "Anyone working on this vehicle needs to carry current hypercar certification and be covered under our service insurance. It's not a preference, it's a contractual requirement. If something goes wrong during an uncredentialed inspection, it voids our coverage and potentially affects the manufacturer warranty." He glanced at Caleb briefly, then back to Vivian. "I understand the impulse, but I can't allow it." What he did not say, because he didn't need to, was the real reason. 8 days, $500,000, a team of credentialed specialists flown in from 2 continents. And now a man in a faded jacket who had arrived in a tow truck was standing on his service floor, suggesting they had missed something basic. If Caleb was right, the professional damage would be severe. If Caleb was wrong, the status quo held, and Victor retained control of the situation. He needed Caleb to be wrong. Vivian looked at Victor for a moment. "I'll sign a waiver releasing Apex from liability for the next 30 minutes, she said. "Get me the form." Victor had no immediate response to that. He stepped back. Caleb asked for 4 things: a flashlight, a multimeter, a thin-walled socket extension, and access to the rear left service panel. A technician near the tool cabinet glanced at Victor before moving. Victor gave a short nod, and the technician retrieved the items. He set them on the workbench without comment. 2 of the other Apex technicians exchanged a look, the kind that people share when they expect to watch someone embarrass himself and want a witness. Mason did not exchange a look with anyone. He crossed his arms and watched Caleb pick up the multimeter, check the probe connections, and set the measurement range with the automatic adjustment of someone who had done it 10,000 times. There was no performance in the movement, no effort to appear capable. Caleb simply picked up the tools and used them. Caleb walked the perimeter of the Bugatti slowly. He didn't rush. He crouched near the rear quarter panel and examined the exhaust mounting bracket for several seconds. He ran 2 fingers along the lower edge of the rear bumper fascia, feeling the seam. Then he stood and moved to the left rear corner of the car, where he knelt again and looked at a section of the undercarriage that was not listed in any of the service documentation spread across Victor's workstation. "There's a concealed panel here," Caleb said, "behind the secondary cooling duct. It's flush-mounted. There's a recessed release tab about 4 centimeters above the duct housing." Victor said, "That location isn't in the service manual for this model." "No," Caleb said. "It wouldn't be. The manual you have covers the standard configuration. This car isn't standard." Mason was already moving. He didn't ask for permission, and he didn't look at Victor. He pulled a pen light from his chest pocket and crouched beside Caleb, angling the beam along the seam Caleb had indicated. He swept the light slowly upward until it caught the faint outline of a recessed tab, barely a shadow in the bodywork, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Mason pressed it, a soft click. A panel the size of a hardcover book released from the body and swung outward on concealed hinges. The service floor went completely silent. Mason stared at the opening. He had been on this car for 8 days. He had run his hands along that exact section of bodywork twice during early inspections. He had felt nothing, seen nothing, and moved on. The panel had been there the entire time. He said nothing. But something shifted in his expression, not embarrassment and not quite relief. Something closer to recognition. The compartment was small, roughly the size of a shoebox, recessed into the body structure behind the rear cooling duct. Inside was a compact wiring assembly, a cluster of color-coded leads, 2 relay housings, and a short run of insulated cable terminating at a mass connection point, bolted to the chassis rail. Everything looked clean. No scorching, no corrosion, no frayed insulation, no visible separation at any of the connectors. Victor leaned in from behind Caleb's shoulder and looked for approximately 3 seconds. "There's nothing wrong with that wiring," he said. Caleb didn't respond. He positioned the multimeter probes, one on the mass connection bolt, one on the chassis ground reference point 18 centimeters away, and read the display. The resistance was elevated. Not dramatically. Not the kind of number that would trigger a fault code or cause a diagnostic system to log an anomaly. But it was higher than it should have been by a margin that would be insignificant in most electrical systems and critical in this one. Caleb sat back on his heels and explained it plainly, addressing Vivian rather than Victor. "This car has a supplemental grounding circuit that isn't in the standard build," he said. "It was added for bespoke North American configurations to stabilize voltage draw in sustained cold conditions. The circuit runs through this mass point." He indicated the connection with the tip of his probe. One of the terminal lugs was seated slightly off-angle during assembly, probably within tolerance by standard inspection metrics, so it passed pre-delivery checks. But metal contracts in the cold. When this car sits overnight in a garage that drops below a certain threshold, the contact resistance at this point increases just enough to interrupt the ignition authorization circuit. The car sees an incomplete ground reference and won't allow the start sequence to proceed. He paused, then continued. When your team came in during the day, the garage had warmed up. The metal expanded back toward its normal position, resistance dropped, and every diagnostic they ran came back clean. The car wasn't broken in any way the equipment could detect, because by the time the equipment was connected, the fault condition had already resolved itself. The service floor was quiet for a long moment. Mason was looking at the mass connection point. He reached into his pocket, took out his notebook, and held it without opening it. He didn't show it to anyone. He just held it and kept looking at the wiring. 2 entries, 2 dates, same instinct written down and set aside. He understood now that the instinct had been right. What he hadn't had was the specific knowledge to take it the final step. That was the difference between him and Caleb, not the quality of the observation, but the depth of the foundation beneath it. Victor said nothing. He was standing slightly behind the group now, and at some point during Caleb's explanation, he had taken a small step backward. The ground had shifted, and everyone in the room could feel it. Vivian watched Caleb set down the multimeter and pick up the socket extension. "Show me the fix," she said. Caleb reached into the compartment and examined the terminal lug with the flashlight. The misalignment was subtle, a few degrees of rotational offset at the crimp point, invisible to a casual inspection and irrelevant in warm conditions. He straightened up and looked at the workbench. "I need a short run of 16-gauge wire and 2 ring terminals," he said, "and something to clean the contact surface. Electrical contact cleaner if you have it, isopropyl if you don't." A technician moved toward the supply cabinet. Victor spoke before the man reached it. "Hold on," Victor said. Everyone looked at him. "What he's describing is a temporary bypass," Victor said, addressing Vivian with the careful composure of someone rebuilding authority, one word at a time. "It's not a certified repair. It's not documented. It's not reversible without a full inspection. And if it causes any downstream electrical issue, we're looking at a warranty dispute with the factory that could run into 6 figures." He paused. "I understand why it seems like a reasonable next step, but we have a responsibility to this vehicle that goes beyond confirming a theory. If Mr. Monroe is correct about the fault location, the proper resolution is to source the correct OEM lug assembly from Molsheim and replace the component under controlled conditions, not to bridge it with aftermarket wire." It was not an unreasonable argument. That was what made it effective. Victor had taken everything Caleb had just demonstrated and wrapped it in procedural language until it sounded like caution rather than resistance. Caleb let him finish. Then he said, "You're right." Victor blinked. "This isn't a permanent fix," Caleb continued, his tone unchanged. "It's a confirmation. A 16-gauge jumper across that mass point will tell us in 30 seconds whether the resistance at this terminal is what's blocking the ignition circuit. If the car starts, we know exactly what we're dealing with and exactly what part to order from Molsheim. If it doesn't start, we keep looking." He looked at Vivian. "The proper repair is a factory lug replacement. That's what I'd recommend after this. But right now, the question is whether we've found the problem. This answers that question without touching anything that can't be undone." Vivian nodded once. "Continue." Victor stepped back. He did it slowly, and he kept his expression neutral, but his hands, which had been gesturing while he spoke, dropped to his sides and stayed there. He was watching now. only watching. And the thing visible in his face was not anger. It was the specific tension of a man waiting for an outcome he could no longer influence. Caleb worked without commentary. He took the wire and terminals from the technician, stripped the ends, cleaned the contact surface on the chassis rail with a folded prep wipe, and fabricated the jumper with the practiced efficiency of someone who had made 1,000 field connections in conditions far less comfortable than this. The movements were compact and certain. No wasted motion, no second guessing, no performance. Mason watched every step. He had worked alongside some of the most credentialed technicians in the country over the past 14 months, and he understood now, watching Caleb work, the difference between someone who had learned a skill and someone who had built it from the inside out over 20 years until it became indistinguishable from instinct. Caleb connected the second terminal, checked the seating, and stood up. He looked at Vivian. She gestured toward the driver's door. Caleb opened it and got in. The inside of the Bugatti Divo smelled like leather and cold air, and something faintly chemical, the particular scent of a car that had been sitting untouched for 8 days while people worked around it without ever sitting inside it. Caleb adjusted the seat slightly, not for comfort, but for reach. He looked over the instrument cluster, the way a doctor looks at a patient chart, not searching, just confirming. Everything he expected to see was where it was supposed to be. He placed his left hand on the steering column and his right on the starter button and did not press it immediately. Outside the car, no one spoke. Vivian stood behind the glass partition with her arms crossed, her right hand gripping her left forearm with a pressure she was not aware of. She had spent 8 days managing the public silence around this problem, deflecting questions from her operations team, delaying a scheduled vehicle showcase, absorbing the cost without explanation. She had not allowed herself to consider what it would mean if the car simply could not be fixed. That was not a scenario she had prepared for. Mason had moved forward without realizing it. He was standing closer to the car than anyone else on the floor. His notebook was still in his hand. He was not thinking about the notebook. He was thinking about the terminal lug, the resistance reading, and the cold Tuesday morning, 8 days ago, when a car had simply refused to start, and no one had thought to ask what the car had been built to do that a standard Divo had not. Victor stood at the outer edge of the group. His arms were at his sides. He had stopped trying to reposition himself in the room and had simply become a witness. The expression on his face was the expression of a man who had staked his professional identity on a particular outcome and could feel it slipping away with nothing he could do to stop it. Caleb pressed the ignition button. For 1 full second, nothing happened. Then the W16 turned over a deep, resonant ignition that moved through the floor of the garage and up through the legs of everyone standing on it. Not a struggling start, not a cough and a catch. A clean, full-throated ignition. The engine settling immediately into its idle with the unhurried confidence of a machine that had simply been waiting for the right conditions. The sound filled the garage and stayed there. Mason exhaled. It came out longer than he expected, like he had been holding it since day 2. He looked down at the notebook in his hand, then set it quietly on the nearest workbench. He did not open it. He did not say anything about what was written inside. He just set it down and looked back at the car. Vivian uncrossed her arms. Victor did not move. He stood at the edge of the floor and looked at the running car for a long moment. Then, without a word to anyone, he walked to the workstation where his team's equipment was staged, picked up his jacket from the back of the chair, and left through the side corridor. No confrontation, no final argument. Just a man who understood that there was nothing left to say and chose the only kind of exit still available to him. The Bugatti idled cleanly at the center of the service floor, its exhaust note a low and even pulse, every system reading exactly as it should. 8 days. $500,000. 6 specialists and 3 diagnostic systems and 2 consultants from Europe. And the answer had been a misaligned terminal lug in a compartment that wasn't in the service manual found by a man who had arrived 40 minutes ago to return a set of lift tools. Caleb stepped out of the car and left the engine running. He set the key card on the roof, closed the driver's door, and looked across the floor at Vivian. She had come through the partition door and was walking toward him. She stopped a few feet away, and for a moment she simply looked at him. The jacket, the worn boots, the hands that had just done in 5 minutes what $500,000 had failed to accomplish. "Who are you?" she said. Not rhetorically. She genuinely wanted to know. Caleb said, "Caleb Monroe. I run a small shop in Queens." Behind him, Mason had already found something on his phone. He turned the screen toward the room without comment. A technical paper from an automotive engineering journal 8 years old listing the contributors to the Bugatti Divo low-voltage validation program. 4th name on the list. C. Monroe Molsheim Testing Division. Vivian read the name on the screen. Then she looked at Caleb. Then she looked at the side corridor where Victor had disappeared. She understood clearly and completely what had happened. She had paid for reputation. She had nearly missed the person who actually knew. The meeting took place in the 2nd floor conference room 30 minutes after the engine started. Vivian, Victor, and 2 members of the Apex administrative team. No technicians. No Caleb, who was waiting downstairs at Vivian's request. Vivian did not open with a question. She opened with a statement. "Walk me through the decision-making process," she said. 8 days. I want to understand how this team arrived at day 9 without identifying the fault. Victor had prepared for this on the elevator ride up. He had arranged his reasoning into a sequence that was factually accurate, procedurally defensible, and completely beside the point, though he did not know that last part yet. "The diagnostic systems we used are the industry standard for vehicles at this level," he began. "They returned clean reads across every session because the fault condition wasn't present during testing hours. That's not a gap in our process, that's a limitation of working with an intermittent electrical fault that resolves with ambient temperature. Without knowing the fault was temperature dependent, there was no protocol that would have reliably caught it in standard working conditions. The supplemental circuit," Vivian said, "was not documented in any of the service materials provided to us," Victor said. "The vehicle's configuration file, the delivery spec sheet, the factory documentation package, none of it referenced a secondary grounding assembly in the rear compartment. We worked from the documentation we had. If the bespoke build record had indicated a non-standard electrical configuration, we would have investigated accordingly." Vivian let a brief silence sit in the room before she spoke again. "In 8 days, she said, did you ask me for the bespoke commission file?" Victor said nothing. "That file is in my office," Vivian continued. "It has been in my office since the car arrived from Molsheim. It includes the full build specification, every non-standard component, and the configuration notes from the factory's low-voltage testing division." She paused. "I would have had it on your workstation within 20 minutes of a request. No one asked." The 2 administrative team members were looking at the table. Victor said, "The standard documentation should have been sufficient for the scope of the initial diagnosis. We escalate to manufacturer build records when standard protocols are exhausted. You recommended tearing out the primary power distribution board this morning," Vivian said, "at an additional cost of $150,000 and 10 days of additional labor. That was your escalation." She looked at him steadily. "At no point in 8 days did escalation mean picking up the phone and asking me for a document that was 20 meters from this room." Victor had no answer that would hold. His team had not failed because the problem was obscure. They had failed because they had decided somewhere around day 2 that they understood the shape of the problem well enough to stop asking foundational questions. They had built a structure of expertise over an incomplete foundation and defended it for 8 days rather than examining it. That was not a diagnostic failure. It was a failure of approach. Vivian looked at him for a moment, then said quietly, "You don't lack knowledge, Victor. You lack the willingness to consider what you might not know." Victor left Crossline Motors that afternoon. Vivian honored the full contract payment, every dollar owed for 8 days of work. She did not call the press. She did not post anything. She simply ended the relationship, paid what was agreed, and closed the door. When the meeting ended and the Apex team had filed out, Mason appeared in the doorway of the conference room. He had not been invited, and he stood there for a moment, as if deciding whether to cross the threshold. Then he walked in and placed his notebook on the conference table in front of Vivian. He opened it to the entry from day 2 and then to the entry from day 5. He didn't frame it as a defense or an accusation. He just let her read it. "I propose checking the supplemental grounding system twice," he said. "I didn't push hard enough either time." He paused. "I should have pushed harder." Vivian looked at the 2 entries. Same handwriting, same clear notation, different dates. She closed the notebook and slid it back across the table toward him. "Keep that," she said. "And remember what it feels like to be right and stay quiet. Don't let it happen again." Mason picked up the notebook and left. Vivian found Caleb on the service floor, standing near the workbench where he had left his tools. He had coiled the multimeter leads and set the flashlight beside them, and he was pulling on his jacket when she came through the door. "I'd like to discuss compensation," she said. "I didn't come here to work on your car," Caleb said. "I came to drop off lift equipment. What happened in there wasn't a service call." "I'm aware of what it was," Vivian said. "I'm also aware that you identified a fault in under 10 minutes, that a credentialed team missed for 8 days, and that the correct repair still needs to be completed when the factory components arrive from Molsheim. You're the only person in this building who knows exactly how that terminal assembly should be seated." She stopped a few feet from him. "I don't pay people out of sympathy. I pay them because they can do something I need done. Those are different things." Caleb considered that for a moment, then nodded. "When the parts come in, I can come back." "I'd also like to talk about a longer arrangement," Vivian said. "Crossline handles 14 bespoke commissions per year minimum. Vehicles with non-standard configurations, factory modifications, custom electrical architectures. Half of them come with documentation gaps similar to what you identified today. I need someone who can look at those cars the way you looked at this one." Caleb was quiet for a moment. He picked up the flashlight and turned it over in his hand once before setting it back down. "That's a different conversation," he said. "I know," Vivian said. "I'm not asking for an answer today." From across the floor, Mason had been working quietly at a secondary bench, reorganizing the diagnostic equipment. He had not left when the rest of the Apex team did. He had made a private decision that he was not finished with the day yet. Caleb noticed him and walked over. Mason looked up. He started to say something, then stopped. "You had the right instinct," Caleb said. "Twice." Mason looked down at the bench. "Didn't do much with it." "You wrote it down," Caleb said. "Both times. That's not nothing." He leaned against the bench and looked at the Bugatti sitting quietly at the center of the floor. "There's a version of this job where you push harder on day 2, and Victor shuts it down again, and nothing changes. Knowing something is right isn't always enough by itself, but knowing you were right that matters, because next time you'll push harder, and the time after that harder still. That's how it builds." Mason was quiet for a moment. "How do you know when to push hard enough that it costs you something?" Caleb thought about that. "You don't always know in advance," he said. "You just have to decide the answer is worth more than the comfort of staying quiet." He straightened up and set the multimeter and the flashlight on the corner of the bench. "Keep those," he said. "The multimeter's a decent unit, better than what you're using." Mason looked at the tools, then at Caleb. "I can't take your equipment." "I've got 3 more at the shop," Caleb said. "Consider it a parting gift from someone who's been where you are." He picked up his jacket and turned to find Vivian standing a few feet behind him. She had watched the exchange without interrupting it. "The parts will take about 2 weeks to come in from Molsheim," she said. "I'll have my coordinator reach out to schedule the repair." "That works," Caleb said. "And the other conversation," Vivian said. "Whenever you're ready." Caleb nodded once. He checked his watch, and something in his expression shifted a small private recalibration, the look of a man remembering where he was supposed to be. "I need to go," he said. "My daughter gets out at 3:15. Caleb was almost at the rear exit when Vivian spoke again. "Mr. Monroe." He turned. She was standing in the center of the service floor, the Bugatti behind her, the overhead lights casting everything in the clean white of a room built to make expensive things look serious. She looked for the first time since he had arrived like someone who was choosing her words carefully, not for professional reasons, but for personal ones. "If you had walked in through the front entrance this morning," she said, "with that jacket and those hands and no appointment, I would have had you escorted out before you reached the floor." Caleb said nothing. "I've been doing this for 20 years, she continued. "I know how to read a room, how to read a contract, how to read a balance sheet. I thought I knew how to read people." She paused. "I was evaluating you against a standard that had nothing to do with what you actually know, and I almost let that cost me considerably more than it already has." Caleb held his jacket in one hand and looked at her for a moment. He wasn't angry. He wasn't gracious about it either, in the performed way that people sometimes are when someone powerful admits a mistake. He just listened, and when she finished, he looked briefly at the Bugatti before he answered. "A machine doesn't care what you're wearing," he said. "It doesn't care what your title is or what you paid to be in the room. It responds to whoever is actually paying attention to it." He said it the way a person states a fact they have known for so long it no longer feels like insight, just reality, plain and undecorated. Vivian nodded slowly. There was nothing to add to it, and she didn't try. Caleb pushed open the rear door and walked out into the cold. The January air hit him clean and sharp after the climate-controlled stillness of the service floor. His tow truck was parked along the rear service lane exactly where he had left it. He unlocked it, tossed his jacket across the passenger seat, and started the engine. The truck ran rough for the first 30 seconds, the way it always did in the cold, then smoothed out. He pulled onto the service lane and turned toward the street, and within 2 blocks, Crossline Motors had disappeared from his mirrors. He turned on the radio, a station he and his daughter had settled on years ago, a compromise between her taste and his that had slowly become just their taste. The particular music of a car ride home that meant the day was done, and the next thing was something good. He did not think about the Bugatti on the drive back to Queens. He thought about whether there was enough in the refrigerator for dinner, and whether his daughter had the history project due tomorrow or Thursday, and whether the brake job waiting in the shop could carry over to the morning without the customer calling to complain. The ordinary weight of an ordinary afternoon settling back into place around him like it always did. Behind him, in a climate-controlled garage in Manhattan, a silver Bugatti Divo sat with its engine off and all its systems reading clean. It had taken 8 days, $500,000, and 1 wrong delivery to find a misaligned terminal lug in a compartment that wasn't in the manual. The machine had been waiting for someone to listen. Caleb Monroe had simply been the first one who did. Real expertise doesn't always come with a business card or a certification on the wall. Sometimes it comes in a dented tow truck wearing a jacket that's seen better days with calloused hands and no interest in impressing anyone. Vivian learned that the hard way. Victor learned it harder still. And Mason, the young technician, who had been right from day 2 but stayed quiet, walked out of that garage with a multimeter, a notebook, and something worth more than either the knowledge that his instincts were worth defending. The stories worth telling are usually about the people who get underestimated. If that's the kind of story you want to keep hearing, subscribe to the channel. There are more of them coming.